Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at a product that's been heavily requested by our Discord members, the Philips Evnia 34M2C8600. Bit of an unwieldy and hard to remember name, but what it does bring is a 34-inch QD-OLED ultra-wide panel, the same one we've now tested in 4 other gaming monitors. Each one of these products has performed slightly differently and had its own quirks, so today we're going to see what Philips are able to do with one of the best gaming panels available on the market today. As we've tested this panel before, its specs are very familiar. 34-inch 3440 by 1440 resolution with an 1800R curvature, which I think is perfect for this type of ultra-wide. Philips are running it up to 175Hz, the same refresh rate as other variants, and it supports adaptive sync. Rated performance includes 99.3% DCI-P3 coverage, 0.03 millisecond grey to grey response times, and there's true HDR capabilities here thanks to the use of QD-OLED tech with Display HDR True Black 400 certification. Philips isn't as big of a brand in the US as say a Dell Alienware or Samsung, but has a reasonable presence in other regions, which is why I think it got so many requests to review it. With that said, it is available in the US, priced at $1,300 US, which is one of the more expensive products in terms of QD-OLED monitors these days, so we'll see how it holds up compared to the others in our testing. The design and build quality for this monitor is pretty interesting. Philips have gone with a mostly white and silver design, which includes silver bezels that wrap around the OLED panel. The panel itself has black bezels, so it ends up with a two-tone finish from the front, which I don't mind. The bottom bezel is slightly larger than what I've seen from other monitors. The stand uses metal for the pillar with a silver finish that looks great, while its legs are white plastic with a bit of blue speckling to it. An interesting look, not sure what to make of it given the white plastic on the rear of the monitor is actually just normal white with no speckling. Philips say that these plastic sections are made from 35% recycled plastic, but that doesn't explain the differences in finish. Maybe one is recycled, one isn't. Anyway, the overall build quality I'd say is okay, probably middle of the range when we're talking about high-end products. We also get height, tilt and swivel support, so the stand does support a good range of motion, and again I do like that metal pillar. What is unique about the Philips variant is the integration of AmbiGlow lighting. I've criticized the use of RGB LED lighting on the back of monitors previously because it often doesn't do anything. It isn't visible or it isn't bright enough to create an ambient lighting effect. AmbiGlow, on the other hand, is an RGB LED lighting system that makes sense. It has far more lighting zones than most monitors, and these LEDs are much brighter than average when set to the highest setting, allowing for a proper ambient lighting effect when the monitor is placed in front of a wall. You can also set these LEDs to match the color of whatever content is being displayed on the screen, which works really well to create an immersive glow around the monitor, and it's all done from within the OSD. No crappy RGB software utilities are required to get that feature working. The trade-off is the rear of the monitor doesn't look that great. It's a function over form situation where the LEDs are just slotted into holes around the otherwise quite basic rear design. It's not too bad when the LEDs are on, but when they're off, it's clear this monitor wasn't designed for setups where you want that nice aesthetic rear. I don't really care what the back of my monitor looks like though, so I'd prefer the AmbiGlow setup. For ports, we get one display port, 2 HDMI ports, a USB-C port with DP alt mode, and a 2-port USB hub. Unfortunately, the HDMI ports are just 2.0 spec, not 2.1, so at the highest resolution they are limited to just 100Hz. Really, HDMI 2.1 should be used here to allow for the full 175Hz over HDMI, but you will get 175Hz over the DisplayPort connector just fine. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle on the rear of the display, however it's a bit harder to navigate through the options than a typical setup. Nevertheless, there's a typical range of features in here, including crosshairs, a sniper mode, black boosting, and various color controls. We also get several OLED panel care features such as a screensaver, pixel orbiting, and pixel refresh, which is in line with other monitors that use the same QD-OLED panel. As the 34M2C8600 uses the same panel as the other 34-inch QD-OLEDs, those that have watched other reviews will be very familiar with some of the issues surrounding the coding and subpixel structure of this QD-OLED panel. There was some talk in our Discord that potentially the Philips model would be using a different coding to the Dell, MSI and Samsung variants, but after receiving it and comparing it side by side, I can confirm this is not the case. If you're not familiar with the coating, here is a quick summary. The QD-OLED panel's coating is glossy and lacks a polarizer, so it can reflect quite a bit of ambient light depending on the conditions. In a standard indoor viewing environment with artificial light or in a sunlit room, blacks can appear grey or raised due to some of this light being reflected off the panel. This is unlike a glossy LG OLED, which appears much blacker even with ambient light in the room. This ambient reflectivity is exacerbated when there's more light in front of the panel, but isn't as problematic when lighting is only behind the display, and it's a non-issue in dimly lit or dark rooms. This can hamper the deep, rich OLED experience in some viewing conditions. OLEDs are famous for their black levels, but with this Philips model, you'll need to have an optimized setup to get the most out of it. It's really hard to say whether this will be an issue for you, as it can be a case-by-case basis. Personally, I do find it annoying and one of the larger issues with these first-generation QD-OLED panels, but if you primarily game at night, it's not anywhere near as much of a concern. At the very least, it's something to be aware of. As for the subpixel structure, it's not ideal for desktop productivity use. The QD-OLED panel uses a triangle RGB layout instead of the traditional RGB stripe, which can cause fringing on some high contrast edges such as text. This is not easily fixable with software corrections. Some people don't notice this issue, but others, including myself, found it reasonably obvious, especially next to a normal LCD. This reduces the crispness and clarity of text in some situations, but is a complete non-issue for content consumption like gaming or watching videos. OLEDs generally aren't great monitors for desktop usage, productivity apps, and web browsing anyway, because they are susceptible to permanent burn-in, so the subpixel issue won't be of huge concern if you are using this monitor as intended for content consumption. But if you do plan on using it for productivity work, you'll not only have to factor in the risk of burn-in into your buying decision, but the suboptimal subpixel layout as well. As for burn-in warranty, Philips are not making any specific claims about burn-in coverage, and their warranty policy varies between countries. I've seen 4- and 3-year warranties in various places, but no specific mention of burn-in, so unfortunately you're not really getting much peace of mind there. Another factor to be aware of is the fan. The Philips monitor has an annoying fan when left on its default setting, though not as annoying as the Alienware model. After around an hour of use, I noticed that the fan would ramp up and down seemingly at random, causing annoying bursts of sound that are much more obvious than, say, a consistent low fan speed. While the monitor does have 3 fan settings in the OSD, auto, quiet, and off, it's only the off setting that gets rid of this behavior, and who knows how that will affect panel longevity if it's designed to be used with the fan on, and Philips show a warning when you switch off the fan, so maybe that's the case. Ideally, the auto mode would be adjusted to have less fan ramping and a more consistent output, which I think would be hard to hear under normal operating conditions, like the AW3423DWF, for example, which has quite acceptable fan noise. In terms of response time performance, it's no surprise to see this QD-OLED panel offering lightning fast speeds, similar to other QD-OLEDs we've tested. At its maximum 175Hz refresh rate, we're seeing a 0.3 millisecond average response, which is extremely fast, and that leads to very clear motion for this sort of refresh rate. With no noticeable inverse ghosting, the Philips model is on par with the other variants for motion clarity and far superior to any LCD at the same refresh rate. The best part of how OLEDs function is that performance is basically identical at all refresh rates. This means whether we're testing at 175Hz or 60Hz, we're still seeing about a 0.3 millisecond average response time. LCDs typically get slower as the refresh rate decreases, but this isn't the case here, so the 34M2C8600 offers a single overdrive mode experience, without any overdrive settings of course, as they aren't required for an OLED. There's no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors. The only difference for motion clarity at the maximum refresh rate is the max refresh itself. The Evnia has a good 175Hz refresh rate, so it will be clearer than something like the LG C2 at 120Hz, but it's only a negligible difference versus, say, the Alienware DWF at 165Hz. However, the 240Hz monitors in this chart, such as the ASUS PG27AQDM and LG 27GR95QE, do have superior motion clarity, as there's less sample and hold motion blur at higher refresh rates like 240Hz. Where the big difference lies is between OLED and LCD. The Evnia is much faster than the fastest LCD I've tested, allowing a 175Hz OLED to deliver a similar experience to a 240Hz LCD in terms of overall motion clarity. This is a big win for OLED, and it only gets better when looking at average performance. While LCDs do get a bit slower at lower refresh rates, OLEDs don't, so the gap between OLED and LCD grows. Here the Philips model is around 10 times faster than some of the highest end LCDs on the market today. It's also good to confirm excellent cumulative deviation results, although no different from most other OLEDs. As expected, this really is the same panel that delivers the same motion performance as other QD-OLED ultrawides. Looking at input latency, the 34M2C8600 has a low processing delay of just 0.1 milliseconds, which is similar to 3 of the other 4 QD-OLED monitors I've tested. This leads to a very responsive experience, though not quite as fast as the top 240Hz OLEDs we have at the moment. It also has higher refresh latency than the PG27AQN at 360Hz, so it depends on exactly what you want from monitor latency. The only main outlier here is the Alienware AW3423DW, which we've looked at previously, and has higher, though not deal-breaker level latency. Power consumption is within the typical range we've seen for QD-OLED monitors at 91 watts for a full-screen white image at 200 nits. The AW3423DWF uses a little less power, while the OLED G8 was the most power-hungry. However, this is a worst-case scenario for OLED, so while power consumption can top out around 125 watts for HDR content, typical usage is a lot lower. For example, watching the opening of this video at 200 nits full screen used around 50 watts of power, which again is pretty in line with some of those other products. For color performance, the 34M2C8600 is a wide gamut monitor with quite high color space coverage. We get 99.4% coverage of DCI-P3 plus 97.4% coverage of Adobe RGB, which is good, though this isn't really a product suitable for color critical productivity work. In total, we get 81% coverage of Rec 2020, which is among the widest gamuts I've tested, though similar to other QD-OLEDs. This provides a nice range of colors that can be used while HDR gaming. When it comes to color calibration, there's good news and bad news. I'll start with the good news, which is that Philips have calibrated this display well at the factory. Grayscale performance in particular is above average, with a very good color temperature, flat gamma, and decent delta E results. The monitor is oversaturated though, as it ships without an sRGB mode enabled by default, so for regular SDR content like desktop apps or YouTube videos, you will see increased vibrance and lower accuracy. Compared to other gaming monitors, factory grayscale performance is great, similar to the Alienware DWF and Samsung G8 models. Color checker performance is more of a typical experience that doesn't elevate itself ahead of other products. The bad news is that Philips don't offer heaps of color controls. We get brightness and contrast adjustment, plus gamma and color temperature selections, but what is missing is any user color temperature controls. So if you happen to get a unit where the built-in presets are slightly off, there's no way to go in and adjust the red, green, and blue values individually, which is pretty odd. I don't often see that omitted from monitor settings. However, there is an sRGB mode that you can toggle on or off. But again, like some other gaming monitors, this will disable all white balance adjustments, even the other presets. There simply isn't anywhere near the control offered here that we get on, say, the OLED G8 from Samsung with its full smart TV processor. With that said, the sRGB mode is actually very good, so this helps to mitigate the lack of other available settings, though in some ways you are trusting that all units will be as well calibrated as this, which is why generally we like to see a good calibrated sRGB mode plus additional user controls. Anyway, we get excellent white balance, great gamma performance, and a strong delta E result. The gamut clamp is also excellent and ends up delivering excellent results. When you compare this to other monitors, the sRGB mode is among the best I've seen. In color checker especially, it outperforms all the other QD-OLED monitors I've tested. A full calibration is possible through CalMan, although performance for SDR apps using the sRGB color space aren't going to be all that different from what we've seen just before, as realistically you could use that mode without calibration. However, with the lack of color controls, this type of calibration will be the only viable option for those who receive a unit that's slightly less well calibrated, as there's usually some variance from the factory. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is identical to the other QD-OLED ultrawides I've tested. The variance here is actually surprisingly little, just 10 nits between the brightest and dimmest models. This matches up well against most WOLEDs, the exception being the PG27AQDM. While I think 240 nits will be fine for most people, it is still dimmer than the vast majority of LCDs on the market. So those that like to use their display at an especially high level of brightness will not love an OLED for SDR desktop usage. Also, there is no automatic brightness limiter or ABL enabled, so brightness in this mode will not change depending on window size, which leads to a great, consistent experience for desktop apps. Minimum brightness is great at just 13 nits, the dimmest of the QD-OLEDs I've tested so far, quite a bit below the Samsung model in particular, so this is excellent news for people that like to game in the dark. As expected, black levels are also 0, as each pixel can be fully switched off to show black, leading to an effectively infinite contrast ratio. Viewing angles are outstanding from QD-OLED panels, so you won't have any issues with color shifting or tint when viewing from off angles. The only concern here would be the curve reducing the visibility of the entire screen, though 1800R is good for gaming at this sort of size and aspect ratio. Uniformity was great as well, continuing a trend of these QD-OLED panels delivering a nice and consistent experience. This Philips monitor is a great HDR display, and this is due to OLED technology's inherent hardware qualities that are tailor-made for displaying HDR content. The key feature here is that each individual pixel is self-lit, meaning at a pixel level, the display can turn on or off to accurately display everything from dark shadows to bright highlights. When the display needs to show pure black, it can fully switch off, giving us the trademark rich zero-level blacks and deep shadows that OLED is known for. This is in contrast to most HDR-capable LCD panels, which are not fully controllable at the pixel level. LCDs require a backlight, and for HDR displays, this typically means the use of full-array local dimming, a technology that splits the backlight into zones. Whereas OLED can turn off each pixel individually, LCDs with local dimming can only turn off certain zones, encompassing hundreds or even thousands of pixels. This can still be effective for HDR content and look great, but it has some fundamental flaws in difficult circumstances. For example, when showing a bright and dark element close together, an OLED can control each pixel as needed with a clean, accurate distinction between bright and dark. LCDs with local dimming need to masterfully control the zones to achieve the necessary distinction between bright and dark, and when the element is too small or not in the optimal position, the bright element can spill into the dark area within the backlight zone, creating ugly blooming artifacts. OLED therefore has the edge when it comes to displaying clean HDR content with minimal blooming or haloing. In some scenes, this will be the difference between raised blacks and deep blacks, such as for starfields and Christmas lights. At other times, OLED can have a brightness advantage for small bright objects within a dark scene. Subtitles will look cleaner on an OLED with reduced blooming, and generally OLEDs produce richer shadows thanks to its inherently higher contrast ratio. Aside from brightness and shadow detail, OLEDs also have other advantages for HDR. As there are no backlight zones, OLEDs are faster to transition between bright and dark with no visible zone transitions. OLEDs are much less likely to suffer from backlight flickering, although light PWM behavior, especially when using a variable refresh rate, is common, and OLEDs like this one do not increase input latency in its HDR mode, as they don't need to run a backlight zone algorithm. The downside to HDR on an OLED is brightness. OLEDs typically don't get as bright as an LCD with full array local dimming in HDR content, especially for large window sizes. And we see that's the case for the Evnia. Full screen HDR brightness is around 240 nits, similar to the SDR mode. 10% window brightness from these QD-OLED panels also isn't amazing at just 440 nits. The Philips model is the least bright of this bunch, but there's only a 6% difference to the brightest QD-OLED, which is negligible. Looking at brightness versus window size, there is no difference between the Philips model and other QD-OLEDs. How this monitor behaves is very familiar, with a steep increase in brightness for very small windows like 2%, which reaches nearly 1000 nits on this display. I've also included the PG27AQDM on this chart, showing the best performing WOLED panel. While this monitor can't reach 1000 nits at 2%, it does hit a much higher level of brightness between 5 and 25% before dropping to below QD-OLED levels for larger windows. Both types of monitor look great for HDR content. Real-world scene brightness is as expected. In Scene 1, performance is very similar to other QD-OLEDs, however Scene 2 brightness was lower than expected at just 541 nits. The best QD-OLEDs I've tested have achieved over 700 nits in this scene, so some tweaking is needed here. For gaming performance, I recorded 915 nits in the scene we normally test with, and an absolute maximum of 975 nits, so a little lower than the best QD-OLEDs, but not drastically so. It's not going to make a huge difference. While the HDR characteristics and overall brightness to this panel are pretty good, unfortunately Philips have botched the calibration, at least if you want to use it in a mode that reaches 1000 nits. And this is very reminiscent of the original AW3423DWF firmware, before Dell eventually fixed it months later. On this particular variant, you'll get the same performance on AMD and Nvidia GPUs, the only difference being that on Nvidia cards, all of the HDR modes are available to choose from when adaptive sync is also enabled. On AMD, the HDR mode options are grayed out, but can be changed if you disable adaptive sync, change the setting, then re-enable adaptive sync after the selection is made. That's an annoying issue with using this monitor with AMD GPUs, but luckily it doesn't actually affect performance. The default mode and the mode that enables 1000 nits of brightness is the Game HDR mode. We've tested it here using a 10% window, which sees brightness limited to around 450 nits, but what is immediately obvious is raised brightness across the entire EOTF range. This means that generally speaking, this image is too bright and inaccurate. And this is even the case if we test at a 2% window, which just raises panel brightness to near 1000 nits. The other mode is the True Black mode, which doesn't suffer from inflated brightness, but does cap brightness to around 450 nits, with no ability to hit 1000 nits. It's also not especially accurate in the higher parts of the EOTF range. It seems that, like the original DWF firmware, Philips is simply scaling up the EOTF curve in the higher brightness Game HDR mode, rather than switching over to a new configuration with a separate, more accurate EOTF curve to run at 1000 nits. And this is pretty obvious when we can change between HDR modes instantly. On the other QD-OLED monitors that do have accurate True Black and accurate 1000 nit modes, the monitor resets briefly between HDR mode changes and updates the metadata provided to the source device. This is the best way of handling multiple HDR modes, and Philips have not done this, so ultimately the HDR mode isn't very accurate. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Philips performs well in the first two sections, only receiving a deduction for using HDMI 2.0 instead of 2.1, and for some limitations in the sRGB mode. I was very impressed with this display's factory calibration, easily meeting Philips' claims. Motion performance numbers are a little exaggerated, 0.03 milliseconds isn't especially realistic, and backlight strobing is not supported. This is a true HDR product with no issues found in its HDR performance specifications. Brightness did come a little under 1000 nits, but not by enough to be an issue. However, it does use a triangle RGB subpixel layout. It is at risk of permanent burn-in, and for some bizarre reason includes no user white balance controls, which I think is a firmware issue. Overall, the Philips Evnia 34M2C8600 is a very similar QD-OLED gaming monitor to the others that we've already tested on the channel. This monitor is the 5th variant, and while each has its own idiosyncrasies, the basic aspects to performance are all quite close between the 5. Even some of the issues I've seen crop up now across multiple variants, which isn't that surprising when the panel is identical. So the good stuff, the QD-OLED panel Philips are using is great. We're getting all the usual OLED advantages like per pixel local dimming, deep zero level blacks, and super fast response times paired with a nice 175Hz refresh rate. This is an excellent display for gaming. You're not going to see many motion artifacts. It's a nice format with the extra immersion of an ultra-wide, good resolution. It's definitely a high-end experience. I also continue to be impressed with the HDR characteristics of this panel. True HDR is of course a reality on an OLED, and it's paired with near 1000 nits of peak brightness in the HDR mode, as well as better full screen brightness than most WOLED panels, which also applies to desktop SDR usage. I think there's a lot to like about this QD-OLED for content consumption, and while I generally wouldn't recommend OLED for productivity work due to the risk of permanent burn-in, I think with the high levels of brightness and less annoying triangle RGB subpixel layout, these sorts of QD-OLED panels are more suited than other OLEDs for desktop app usage. There are some downsides to this QD-OLED panel that we see again with the Philips model that aren't unique to this monitor. The poor screen coding and aforementioned subpixel layout, risk of burn-in and so on, these are all factors common to this panel. Doesn't matter whether you buy the Philips, Dell, Samsung or MSI models, it's just the fundamental nature of this panel. Outside of simply using a great QD-OLED panel, Philips have done a couple of things especially well and provided some unique benefits. One of them is their Ambiglow RGB LED lighting system on the rear, if you like the idea of bright, useful ambient lighting that's integrated into this display. I was also very impressed with factory calibration in the SDR sRGB mode. This is a class-leading monitor in that regard, which lessens the impact of not including user white balance controls, which is a bit of a weird one. But unfortunately, Philips have made the same mistake as Dell did with the original AW3423 DWF firmware, in that the HDR mode only offers you a choice between an inaccurate mode that can hit 1000 nits and an accurate mode that's limited to 450 nits. This is not a good experience, especially because none of its competitors suffer from the same problem, especially now that the DWF is fixed. When there's not a lot separating all the different QD-OLED models, issues like this become deciding factors. I maybe could have still justified recommending the Philips model to some users until I saw the price. At $1,300 US, it's simply too expensive in the current market. Right now, the Alienware DWF is priced at $1,000 US, and I think the DWF is a better monitor, so it's a no-brainer to pick that model up for $300 less. The OLED G8, I think the best of the QD-OLED pack, is currently matching the Philips model in price, so it too would be a superior choice. I've seen a similar pricing structure between these models in Australia, though of course it may vary for you in other regions. Links in the description below, you can check pricing there, but the bottom line is that it needs to be priced below the DWF variant to get my recommendation at the moment. Philips could improve their position by correcting a few things, a few of the issues, through a firmware update, especially to address HDR performance, and a small price cut wouldn't go astray either, but until that happens, I'd probably stick to some of the other models that I've tested. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you do appreciate our monitor coverage here at Monitors Unboxed, please do consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and down in the description below you'll see links to our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. If you want to sign up, become a Hardware Unboxed supporter, you will get access to some cool perks, one of which is the Discord community, which again is how really I found out about this monitor. A lot of people are tossing up whether to buy this or one of the other models, so yeah, I thought I'd reach out to Philips, get one in for testing. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.